the mics, no? You ready? I'll ask them to turn on the mic.
People have to sit here.
Yeah, so we told them to sit unless we start, they're not going to sit.
This is adult audience.
Yeah. So they won't start unless we start speaking here.
Then people will invariably sit and listen. Hello.
So, how do you pronounce your name? Tetsuo?
Tetsuo is my first name.
Yeah. Tetsuo
Kotani family name.
Good morning, everyone. Could I request you to please take your seats? We're going into the next session.
Okay. All right. Can you just fold it?
So, welcome to the first discussion session after the Foreign Secretary and the Ambassador of Japan. They have laid out the very broad canvas of what we are going to be talking. Thank you, Carnegie India and IDF, for inviting me to chair this session on the Regional Maritime Security Cooperation. And we have three very distinguished speakers with us. We have Tetsuo Kotani-san from Japan, Darshana Baruah from the Carnegie India, and my old friend Admiral Jayanath Colombage, who is the former Sri Lankan Navy chief. They will discuss the collaborative mechanism through the capacity building in this area, maritime domain awareness, how we are going to be ensuring security and a peaceful environment for all that we have been talking so far as the progress and prosperity in the region is concerned. I think there will be some discussion on the bilateral, trilateral and multilateral security, the efforts which are on in this Bay of Bengal area and in the wider Indian Ocean. All I wish to say, while this debate on economy first or the security first is sort of never ending, like somebody said, it's like the chicken and egg story. But all I can say is that the security cooperation has a very profound impact on the bilateral and multilateral relations, for it to improve or to become bad. If you see the challenges in the Bay of Bengal littorals, most of them are security related. National, transnational terrorism, insurgency. But one area where I think we can now begin to cooperate in a much bigger way is the maritime security dimension. We have settled maritime borders, if you like, with every country. There is a fairly law-abiding part of the world, and we would like to see maintain this. We have had the challenges of like the humanitarian issues between Bangladesh and Rohingya, which has a profound impact on the whole region. So these virtually actually go about making the political discourse on which the entire economy and the security discourse is based. Before they start, I will just make a few points. The Foreign Secretary mentioned about the historic connectivity. I would just like to remind our very distinguished audience that historically, if you go back, the Mauryan Empire, the 2nd, 3rd century BC, were followed by the Cholas, where India's connectivity was contiguous all over the India's present east coast, whole of eastern peninsula, Indian peninsula, west coast of present-day Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, and extending right up to Indonesia. So this is not new, really. It is just that during the Mughal period, we become more and more inward-looking, and we lost track of this bigger maritime picture. But I think, as he said, that we are back, and thankfully we are back. So that is where I'll take off from. He also mentioned about India has to take the lead. It is the fastest growing economy in the region, and therefore, and it's a big country. What the Navy is doing is that it's trying to provide a very peaceful environment for this area for elevation of poverty, where millions of people are below poverty line. Regional development that India is looking at is very much linked to its own internal Northeast Development Program and the India's Act East policy. Timing of this deliberation is very right, because the Indian Naval Commanders Conference has just begun yesterday and discussing about the same things. So we are very much in sync, and I must compliment Carnegie for choosing the right time. Navy has begun to work towards the realization of Prime Minister Modi's vision of Sagar, that is security and growth for all in the region, and the manner in which the security, cooperation, capacity building initiatives can bring these nations even closer, not only in Bay of Bengal but whole of Indian Ocean region. And Japan's contribution here in capability building and infrastructure development is going to be very, very significant. The discussions which are taking place in the Sena Bhavan right now, they are also looking at the upgradation of trade and security infrastructure in the Andaman Nicobar Islands. There was some question in the last session, so that is very much on the cards. So you will hear something very soon, that what is going to happen to the but Navy has taken a decision that at any one time 15 ships will be deployed in the Indian Ocean region, and at least one PATI aircraft on the eastern seaboard. On the western seaboard will always be on patrol, because for this whole security thing to remain is a one big picture, you require what is called the maritime domain awareness. I think probably Darshana will speak about it a little later, so I don't want to say anything, but that requires updation. Indian Navy has at the moment 140 ships roughly and 230 odd aircraft, and as per the long-term integrated perspective plan, it's likely to become 200 plus ship Navy and 450 plus aircraft by 2027, which is the original end of the 5-year plan. The Navy has decided to provide mission-ready warships and aircraft all along the sea lanes of communication and the choke points, right from Malacca Strait, Sunda, possibly Mumbai Salat, and going up to the west coast into the Gulf of Aden and the Persian Gulf. So that's the area where, apart from being a net security provider, they have to fulfill the roles of more non-conventional threats as well. HADR, the possibly search and rescue. Every ship will have a HADR brick, as it is called, to support the BRICS nations in case of a disaster as the first responder in the whole region. So I thought I'll just put this security dimension in perspective, so that all of us are on the same page and not imagining as to what will happen. Navy has taken the lead, and the Sagar Navy wants to do its bit. So this 15 ships on deployment and the PATI Boeing on deployment 24/7 has already begun. Therefore, the refit cycles, the maintenance of rest of the ships, etc., has been now worked in a manner that yesterday I was having a small chat with the Chief of Naval Staff, and it's all in place. So with that little bit of backdrop as far as the security is concerned,
Let me first invite Tetsuo Kotani-san to come and make his presentation. Thank you.
Well, good morning. First of all, let me thank the conference organizer for inviting me, particularly Dr. Raja Mohan and Darshana Baruah and Sharan Rajiv for taking care of my logistics. And secondly, I have to say, this is my personal view on Japan's contribution to the Bay of Bengal. And in fact, the title given to me says Japanese plans for regional capacity building. But I'm not sure whether the Japanese government has such a plan yet. So this is basically my personal views on Japanese contribution to the capacity building in the Bay of Bengal. And I think I have to start with my assumption that the Bay of Bengal is kind of a missing link in Japanese maritime security policy. Over the past several decades, Japan has played important roles in the security of Straits of Malacca and Singapore, and South China Sea, and Arabian Gulf for counter-terrorism, and the Gulf of Aden for counter-piracy. But in the past, Japan has never played a greater role in the Bay of Bengal, particularly in security realm. And perhaps the reason is the lack of the urgent security challenges in Bay of Bengal. But that doesn't necessarily mean Japan has never contributed to the Bay of Bengal region. Of course, the ODA, through ODA, Japan has contributed a lot. All the Bay of Bengal countries are the recipients of Japanese ODA. And also, Japan initiated the RECAP, the Counter-Piracy Regional Institution, and all the Bay of Bengal countries are a member of it. And also, Japan Coast Guard initiated the Head of Asian Coast Guard agency meetings more than 10 years ago. And in fact, all the Bay of Bengal countries' Coast Guards are the member of it. And plus, Japan has developed a strategic vision to the Indian Ocean. About 10 years ago, the Japanese Foreign Ministry advocated the concept of arc of freedom and prosperity, which emphasized importance of the common values. And then the Prime Minister Abe in 2007 introduced the concept of the Conference of the Two Seas. And right after that, he developed his concept into the democratic security diamond among Japan, US, India, and Australia. But this diamond, of course, covered the Bay of Bengal area. And today, the Japanese government is now promoting the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, emphasizing the common values and the high-quality infrastructure development, the rule of law, and maritime security. So there's a vision in the Bay of Bengal for Japan, but so far we haven't conducted the concrete projects, particularly for security realm in the Gulf of, in the Bay of Bengal. And I think to develop such plans for Japan to contribute to the Bay of Bengal, I think we have to start with the Japan-India strategic partnership. And actually this is going to be the key for Japan to engage in the Bay of Bengal countries. Just recently, Japan joined the Malabar exercise in the Bay of Bengal, But our first participation was actually in 2007. So about 10 decades, for about the 10 decades, our Maritime Self-Defense Force has been engaging in the Bay of Bengal. And now, as India advocates the Act East policy, there's a conference of Japanese and Indian strategic visions in the Bay of Bengal. So what kind of security challenges we have to address? I think the first issue is, of course, the piracy, and more precisely, the armed robbery against the ships inside the territorial waters. Because over the several years, there has been no piracy in the high seas, in the Bay of Bengal. But there are several armed robbery incidents inside the territorial waters of the littoral countries. So this is something we have to address. And plus, the terrorism is still an important issue here. And as the IS shrinks its activities in Iraq and Syria, we have to expect they will increase their activities outside the Middle East. IS fighters are now returning home, and some of them may coming back to this region. So we have to prepare terrorism, including the maritime terrorism in the Bay of Bengal. And the HADR is, of course, the key challenge we are facing. This region suffers from the cyclones, earthquakes, and tsunami. So, HADR is very, very critical to preserve the stability in this region. And in addition, let me raise the issue of Rohingya, the so-called Rohingya issue. I'm not going to talk about its political aspect, but I think it's very important for us to address its humanitarian aspect of this issue. And the other challenges include the MDA, which will be covered by Darshana later in this session, and the search and rescue is, of course, important. Several years ago, Malaysian Airlines 370 disappeared, and it's still missing. And we couldn't locate this aircraft, and which indicates the lack of maritime domain awareness capabilities in this region. So we have to work on it. And the last challenge I'd like to raise is the China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. I'm not saying that we have to counter this concept, but at least I think we have to balance this Chinese initiative to make sure that the China's initiative can continue to be transparent and accountable and environmentally friendly, and also responsible for the local economy. And if we can work together with China's BRI concept effectively, I think we can bring about the synergy effect in this region. There's an obvious requirement for the infrastructure building in this region. So I think we have to continue to discuss how we can collaborate with among the different initiatives. And that said, however, we have to worry about the possible military implication of Chinese initiative. For example, why China needs to send submarines to the Bay of Bengal? They say it's for counter-piracy, but nobody believes it. The primary mission of submarines is sea denial, not counter-piracy. So we have to wonder why. So we have to make sure the Chinese concept will never become the string of pearls with a military implication. So, as I said, so far Japan has no concrete plan for the regional engagement in the regional capacity building program in the Bay of Bengal. But let me point out several issues for Japan to consider. First of all, I think Japan should listen to the regional countries' voices. What is the expectation? What is the requirement among the regional countries? And we have to identify how Japan can contribute. And also we can utilize the existing institutions and frameworks such as RECAP or the Head of Asian Coast Guard Agency Forum, or Japan is an observer of the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, so we can also work through this institution. And before concluding, let me raise three important pillars for a future Japan's strategy in the Bay of Bengal. The first pillar, I think, is the law enforcement capabilities of regional countries. And here, Japan has a very established experience in the Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. And I think we can adapt this example to the Bay of Bengal. What Japan has done in the South China Sea is, first of all, we provide ships,
if you like.
and we provided trainings and education to the law enforcement officers. So I think we can do so, and we have already provided the patrol boats to Sri Lanka, but I think we can expand this program to other Bay of Bengal countries. And the HADR should be another key element. And again, I think we can learn the lesson from the Southeast Asia. What Japan has been doing is, I think one of the very important example Japan has done in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia is what is called the Pacific Pacific Partnership. This is a humanitarian assistance program where the U.S., Japan, and the other regional countries provide hospital ships or hospital capabilities to the regional countries so that we can provide humanitarian assistance to the distant areas, remote island areas. And I think this program can be adapted in the Bay of Bengal region as well. And the third pillar is a little bit more sensitive than the others, which is the military capabilities. The big challenge for Japan to provide the military capability to this region is because most of the Bay of Bengal countries receive the military equipments and platforms from China and Russia, particularly for the combat capabilities. So it's not easy for Japan to provide the combat capabilities to this region. But that doesn't necessarily mean we cannot assist the regional militaries in this region. For example, Japan recently decided to provide the patrol boats to Vietnam, despite our different political regimes. And also, we are providing submarine medics for Vietnamese submariners. Submariners need special medics, and Japan Self-Defense Force provides the education on it to the Vietnamese submariners. So that's something I think we can do when India or Bangladesh are operating submarines. And also, I think we can provide search and rescue capabilities, including US-2, and also transport capabilities to this region, and also the training capabilities. We recently decided to provide a training aircraft to the Philippines for free. Until recently, we couldn't provide our second-hand platforms to other militaries for free, but early this year we changed the law. So now we can provide second-hand capabilities to the regional militaries. And lastly, in terms of military capabilities, I like to include the MDA, Maritime Domain Awareness capabilities. Japan is now developing the MDA systems, both consisting of classified and unclassified systems. And I think this system can provide a model for the regional militaries as well. And also for the Japanese system, the satellite image is a key component. And today you don't have to build your own satellites to get the satellite images. You can get satellite images from commercial companies, and the prices are now becoming very reasonable. So if you like to purchase those satellite images, perhaps Japan can assist through certain projects. And lastly, as I said, I think the Japan-India cooperation should be the key for Japan to engage in this region. And before conclude, let me remind you of a concept which appeared about 10 years ago, which is the necklace of diamonds. And actually, necklace of diamonds concept was developed by Indians to counter the Chinese string of pearls. But diamonds are more precious than pearls. So I think if the regional countries agree to develop a necklace of diamonds along the Indo-Pacific region, I think that can be a good concept to pursue. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kotani-san. I'll invite Darshana to speak. You can speak from here if you wish to. Yeah.
Thank you, Admiral Sinha. I'm speaking on India's approach to maritime domain awareness. And just before I get into it, I'll quickly touch upon where India was on maritime domain awareness and where are we heading. Before I start up, I just wanted to kind of quote the concept of an MDA as stated by the Indian Navy in its maritime strategy published in 2015. It really is about situational awareness at sea. It is being aware of the position and intentions of all actors, whether own, hostile or neutral, and in all dimensions, on, over and under the seas. So the two things about MDA. One is that the scope and the operation of MDA is huge, and the second is no one country alone can really achieve a full picture on the domain unless you work in partnerships or unless you work with friends. For India, there has been a considerable change in the tone and the role of MDA in its strategy. There's a difference between the 2009 doctrine and the 2015 maritime strategy, and the increasing role is perhaps into 2015 is perhaps reflected through from a changing maritime environment. The first drastic change in MDA, or rather the evolution of a stronger MDA policy for India, came into place after the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai in 2008, when an Indian fishing vessel was hijacked and terrorists sailed up to the coast of Mumbai. That incident really signified three things. First was there were significant gaps in India's coastal surveillance system. Second, that the lack in its surveillance capabilities also highlighted perhaps India's negligence of its maritime defense strategy vis-a-vis a maritime outlook, that you have a coastline of 7,500 kilometers and it wasn't as secured as you wanted it to be, and perhaps that was also reflected by the time that happened where India was more comfortable with the environment, maritime environment it had around itself. Third, this incident also made it clear that India's security threat was no longer restricted to its northern continental borders, that although that threat remains most imminent. So the first response was really to completely change India's coastal surveillance framework. Multiple initiatives were taken. It's led by the Navy. I won't go into the details, but the idea was to provide seamless cover, 24/7 cover of India's entire coast, including measures to monitor all activities along its coast. Then India also established in 2014 the IMAC, the Information Management and Analysis Center, and established joint operation centers in Mumbai, Visakhapatnam, Kochi, and Port Blair, which are manned 24/7. And there is more inter-agency interactions and operations between the Navy, Coast Guard, and the Marine Police. So that was Coastal MDA, which is of course extended to your exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, and the waters around it. But right after 2611, for the few years right after that, the priority at that point was completely securing the immediate coastal waters. Now, the wider maritime environment is changing as well, and the activities in the waters beyond the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, is changing as well. The strategic landscape of the Indian Ocean is changing. We're seeing much more strategic competitions. We're also seeing a much more increase in initiatives by different countries, individually, bilaterally, and trilaterally. So there are new actors in play. There's a revival of regionalism. We've talked about revival of BIMSTEC, the Indian Ocean Community. So this really is adding towards changing the security framework. So India's MDA initiatives have also now expanding, and it has in fact become a key factor, a key component in most of India's maritime discussions with its partners. Information sharing is really the core of a strong regional MDA. As I mentioned, no one country can cover the entire Indian Ocean or the entire Pacific or the Bay of Bengal. You need help, you need friends, and you need partners. So India is now building up its MDA profile through its maritime partnerships. While India realizes the need to expand its MDA operations, I think the Navy is also aware in the challenges in MDA in implementation. The domain, as I mentioned, is too vast, and countries would have to come together and share resources and assets in mapping and scoping the activities in these areas of interest. To cover the operational challenges of MDA, India is partnering with friends and neighbors, big and small, creating a regional MDA structure. MDA collaboration allows India to expand its own reach and presence in the wider Indian Ocean, as well as provide strategic advantages in responding to a changing security environment. India really has two roles in its MDA collaboration, one as a leader and the other through joint collaborations. India plays a leading role in providing wider security to its maritime neighbors, such as Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, and Seychelles. And of course, we also, the Foreign Secretary talked about the importance of Bangladesh and Myanmar to our eastern coast. It is then also collaborating with other countries such as US, Japan, Australia, France, and UK to strengthen its existing capabilities and cover the wider Indo-Pacific. So in its partnerships with its neighbors and its partners, there are a few things that India is doing. I think one of them is white shipping. India is in the process of signing white shipping with a lot of countries. A lot of them have already been signed. White shipping really covers commercial activity, but it gives you a good picture. It is also a trust-building mechanism and a measure that can perhaps translate into something more in sharing more complicated and sensitive data. There's of course capacity building, that countries come together and provide security in that region. Coordinated patrols. India does multiple coordinated patrols. We have with Indonesia, with Myanmar. We do trainings. We also provide coastal surveillance radars to these countries. So it's happening at the bilateral level and then at the trilateral level as well, both in the Bay of Bengal and in the Indian Ocean region. At an individual level, India has just recently, earlier this year, announced the initiative to launch an information fusion center in India. which was really, one is getting the data and mapping of it through satellite images and other assets, and then the other is to really have a center which collates all the data for you to provide you that picture that you need to maintain that awareness. So Information Fusion Center in India perhaps would be something along the lines of what we have in Singapore on RECAP on the east, and the one coming up in Madagascar on the west. So in the Indian Ocean, an Information Fusion Center would really cover the entire Indo-Pacific, with Singapore on the east, with India in the Indian Ocean, and Madagascar on the west. For India, the MDA partnership with its maritime neighbors is most crucial. So for the Bay of Bengal littorals, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Myanmar, and I think India also wants to work more with Indonesia, and India does carry out coordinated patrols with Indonesia. Then of course on the Indian Ocean littoral island states of Maldives, Mauritius, and Seychelles. You also have other regional actors such as US, Japan, and Australia, France, and the EU powers who are doing more in the Indian Ocean, who wants to collaborate more. So each country really brings something to the table, and everyone has a role to play. And collective security has to be the model going forward on maritime domain awareness. There is a scope for maritime framework to develop in the Bay of Bengal region, perhaps the revival, the first thing we talked about, revival of BIMSTEC, and there is scope for a framework within the architecture of BIMSTEC. The littorals of the Bay of Bengal together, Sri Lanka, India, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Indonesia would have to do more as the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific grows. The Bay of Bengal will also regain its significance as the bridge connecting the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And information from illegal fishing to white shipping to commercial activities shared between these countries will contribute in providing that larger picture on activities in the region. This information is not just for tracking activities, but also helps going forward in exercises and search and rescue operations and HDR operations. There are patrols, as I mentioned, carried out, coordinated patrols with Myanmar and Indonesia. Maybe that can be strengthened. Corpus coordinated patrols form a building block in MDA. As I mentioned, MDA is all about information sharing, and that is something that is a bit sensitive and requires much more trust between countries who are working together. And India's presence in the Bay of Bengal and then in the Andamans really provided great platform for collaboration for regional MDA operations. And we had some questions about on Andamans in the earlier session, and that India is finally taking an initiative to do more. The Foreign Secretary talked about India really wanting to lead South Asia. So with Andamans can really emerge as a platform for regional asset for MDA collaboration going forward. But as India looks to do more and wants to do more on maritime domain awareness, we sign white shipping and go on to share information. It would also have to perhaps talk and discuss about new concepts such as burden sharing, concepts such as perhaps joint facilities and collective security. A new security framework is being discussed. So you can also reframe these concepts to India might have issues with these concepts of burden sharing or joint facilities, but you also have the scope to re-engage and renegotiate the terms and work out a new framework that works to your scenario and for the larger neighborhood. While India's MDA efforts in coastal waters have been remarkable in some ways, its approach in the larger Indian Ocean perhaps still requires some boost. Of course, this is work in progress, work is happening, but India's presence beyond the sphere of influence is still a bit limited. While India continues to build its capabilities as a response to changing maritime domain, it will have to continue to partner with friendly navies in advancing its MDA goals. India will have to continue talking to its neighbors and powers, big and small, and it is well placed today to shape its terms of engagement as the region needs India's leadership as much as India wants to reinforce its own dominance again. So as a concluding note, I think, as I mentioned, Delhi is well placed to negotiate the terms of engagement as we go forward and forge closer relationships, and it will have to keep working with these countries to build its MDA capabilities, translate some of the work into take it to the next step, and perhaps do complicated exchanges and exercises and deepen the conversations as it continues to strengthen its own capabilities and experiences in a changing security environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Darshana. Let me now invite Admiral Colombage to make his presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or rather good afternoon. On 26 December 2004, at 0905, the Trincomalee Harbour, the water level started rising. I was the acting area commander, a young commodore. We did not know what was happening. We only saw the water level rising, and then little later we came to know that was a tsunami. We had no experience of a tsunami, because the last one happened more than 2,000 years ago, before we were born. And to the credit of Indian Navy, on the same day evening, the first ship, which was on patrol in Cork Strait, arrived off Trincomalee port. They could not berth because the facilities were gone, but they berthed the next day morning with some few essential things. She was not ready for the mission. She was on patrol. She had a small helicopter, few rubber-flated dinghies, few outboard motors, few water pumps, and small supply of medicine. But that saved a lot of lives aftermath of tsunami. So first, let me thank the Indian Navy for their wonderful response in one of the worst natural disasters to ever take place in this part of the world, especially to Sri Lanka, because we lost 35,000 people in that incident. That was great, so hats off to Indian Navy. And I also like to thank Carnegie India and IDF for inviting me to come here to Delhi to share my thoughts on a very important topic on connectivity, but through the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And I think this is an area we can easily cooperate, because the nature do not separate us. They don't know which country we are from. They come and destroy us. So therefore, this is one area we can easily collaborate. Disasters can occur without any warning. We have seen it happening time and again. People and physical structures anywhere can be vulnerable. No one will be spared. However, this argument that if you are poor and underdeveloped, you are more vulnerable to disasters. But that was proven wrong in the Typhoon Irma, because such a developed country like America was devastated by a natural disaster. What are the common disasters in the Indian Ocean region? We have droughts, we have general and flash floods. In 2003, in one of the worst flash floods in Sri Lankan context, water level rose by 60 feet within 2 hours. Unbelievable. We have tsunamis. Well, the next one may not come anytime soon, let us wish. And also we have tropical storms and cyclones. And we have industrial accidents, basically the negligence or safety procedures, man-made. Then we have displaced populations. It could be due to conflict, or it could be due to natural hazards. Humanitarian assistance is another term which is associated with the disaster relief, that is basically to provide relief to affected people, or to provide relief to people who are likely to be affected even after a disaster has struck them. Then humanitarian assistance is not limited to military situation. It can be even for natural disasters as well as for conflict areas. There are violent insurgencies, terrorism-related incidents taking place in this region, and that in fact displays large number of people within the countries or across the borders. Humanitarian assistance is now given even while the fighting is going on, so that makes the task of the assistance provider even more risky and difficult. There need to be a collaboration between the militaries and non-military organizations in providing humanitarian assistance, because we operate on two different levels. The immediate effect could include in a disaster is to include loss of life and damages to property and infrastructure. There will be shortage of shelter, food, water, sanitation facilities, and medical supplies. Some of the victims may suffer from shock and trauma. The primary aim of a disaster response plan should be to rescue affected people as quickly as possible and as safe as possible in an organized manner, and then to evacuate them to a safer place. Responding and mitigating a disaster continuing, they should not be exposed to a secondary disaster like in the case of an earthquake. In Sri Lankan tsunami, what we have experienced is the destruction was worse during the second wave, not the first wave, simply because we did not know what tsunami was, and we thought the sea is becoming more available to us. We can acquire little more land, and we died in the process. After the immediate reaction is done, we have to restore the essential services such as power and water, and those two should be priority. Once the basic infrastructure facilities are restored, victims can be assisted to return to their localities, and then whatever assistance needed can be provided. We cannot prevent disasters taking place, but we can harden or we can minimize the vulnerabilities that we possess, which becomes vulnerable should there be a disaster. So disaster preparedness refers to measures taken to prepare for and reduce the effect of disaster. That is something we can do. That is something the regional cooperation can provide us. In the context of South Asian region, so please pardon me, I am not limiting my focus to the Bay of Bengal, because Sri Lanka is one country which has on the one side the Arabian Sea, that is the Western Indian Ocean, like India, and on the other side the Bay of Bengal. So when I talk about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, I am talking about the region as a South Asia region. So South Asian region is exposed to a variety of hazards, mainly due to the geographical location. This region is one of the most disaster-prone regions in the world. Out of 10 deadly natural disasters since 1980, 3 has taken place in the South Asian region. These disasters include tsunamis, earthquakes, cyclones, and low-intensity conflict. Climate change has increased the frequency of these disasters. And regional cooperation, we heard in the morning, in South Asia is not easy. We have political sensitivities. We have trust deficit. We don't trust each other in this region. And of course, there is disparity between size and capability. So therefore, it is very difficult to find regional cooperation in the South Asian context. Although SAARC, immediately after tsunami in 2005, came out with a disaster management prevention center, establishing disaster management prevention centers. But it has not moved beyond that. We have not been able to move beyond establishing these centers in around 2005. So that speaks volumes of the progress or the lack of progress in SAARC. However, we can see a success story in ASEAN. Now ASEAN in 2011, 10 countries got together and they established a center called AHA Center, that is humanitarian or the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Center. Now that is established in Indonesia. So we can take a sample, we can take an example of what ASEAN has achieved in the area of HADR through that. Now this was aimed at facilitating cooperation and coordination among ASEAN members, and their motto is one ASEAN, one response. But when you apply that to South Asia, unfortunately, we cannot say the same. We have one South Asia, but many different responses. So ladies and gentlemen, in this process, in the absence of an effective AHA center for South Asia, I would like you to consider Sri Lanka as a hub for HADR operations in the region. Why I say Sri Lanka is suitable? One thing is the best advantage Sri Lanka is having is the location. Of course, South Asia is the center of Asia, and also South Asia is the center of Indian Ocean. But if you really take the maritime perspective, Sri Lanka is right in the spot in the Indian Ocean. And Sri Lanka is located very close to the busiest east-west shipping route, passing just 12 nautical miles south of the country. So that means in any emergency, supplies or assistance can come easily to Sri Lanka and thereafter to the region or the country affected. Then Sri Lanka is blessed with deep water ports. We have deep water ports in east, south and the west. Now the biggest container ship ever to enter one of the South Asian ports entered Port of Colombo last week. And that was a 400-meter ship which was carrying more than 20,000 TEUs. So that means our ports are capable. And then we have good navigable waters at the entrance and exit to these ports. So we are very well connected in the maritime domain. And also Sri Lanka maintained balanced foreign relations. We call it equidistance or balanced foreign relations. We are considered a friend by everyone. And anybody can come to Sri Lanka freely, whether it is our Indian friends or Pakistanis, Chinese, Japanese or Americans. Everyone can come to Sri Lanka. There is no restriction and they do come to Sri Lanka. And also Sri Lanka is well connected digitally. Of course, a lot has to be done, but still we are very well connected with an advanced telecommunication network. And also we are very well connected within the aviation sector, within the region as well as outside the region. So these are all plus points for my suggestion to have Sri Lanka as a center for HADR. And also, after 2004, lot of work has been done on disaster relief and disaster management in Sri Lanka. We in fact have a separate act for disaster management. We have a disaster management center which is very effective, and we have been able to combine a lot of experiences we gained from tsunami into the disaster management center and the work of it. And this disaster management center coordinate all stakeholders, both domestic as well as foreign agencies like ICRC or United Nations and other countries. And also, when you consider all these factors that I mentioned, I think Sri Lanka is in a better position to be the AHA Center or the South Asian Center for Humanitarian Assistance in the region. So in conclusion, let me reiterate to you, disasters will happen without notice, and they are becoming even more common, more frequent and more dangerous. And now we have a situation where most of our populations are urbanized and living close to the coastal areas, and therefore they are vulnerable to, or they are prone to more and more disasters. And many governments, we have seen it time and again, are unprepared or underprepared to handle a disaster situation on its own. And therefore, we cannot prevent disasters, but we can harden our vulnerabilities in order to prevent or in order to minimize the possible damages a disaster would bring. Humanitarian assistance is needed whether in hostilities or in natural disasters. And there is a need to develop great understanding and collaboration among humanitarian agencies. We don't have it when we only knee-jerk reaction in most of the cases in the region. There's a need to develop a regional mechanism. Even United Nations suggests that we have regional mechanisms in addition to the international mechanisms to handle disasters. We don't have one in the South Asian region. The Sendai framework, which came into being in 2015 in Japan, talk about this regional organization to handle disasters. So Sri Lanka is ideally located geographically to be a hub in this region with deep water ports, diplomatic connections, and all the positive points that I mentioned. And also, I would suggest that we need to think about having a disaster management center in the South Asia without waiting until the next disaster take place in the region, and we try to find what happened. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral. Before I open the floor for question and answers, I just have possibly one or two questions each for my speakers who have made a very good presentation. Two questions, Kotani-san, from you. You mentioned about this, the provision of MDA, both classified and unclassified. How many countries have you shared this unclassified, the white shipping data? Because India has been trying very hard to get Japan to get connected to our own MDA, but we have not reached where we are supposed to. So that is one question. Secondly, also mentioned about the satellite imagery from your commercial satellites. That's what you meant.
Not ours, but international companies.
Okay. So international satellite, meaning that will those satellite operators or the ones who have launched, will they be willing to make the ground station available in the countries that we are talking about in the region for this kind of cooperation? So these two questions.
Well, thank you very much. For the first question, actually the declassified system is actually open to everybody. So if you go to the certain website of our government MDA site, you can get all the data available for inside the declassified area. Of course, the classified area it's shared by the Japanese government agencies, but even the declassified system, it includes the satellite images, AIS data, and others. So it's very useful. And for the second question, in fact, on the process of Japanese own MDA system, we find it very important, the satellite images for a system. But it's not easy to launch satellites. And particularly for this declassified information, you cannot use our military satellites. So one way our government thought about is to utilize the commercial company satellite images, and it's more and more civilian companies are operating satellites, and I think and the prices are now becoming cheaper and reasonable. So if you can get the sufficient fund, I think you can ask those commercial companies to get the satellite images where you need to get those information.
Okay, thank you. Darshana, just one short question. You mentioned about the maritime domain awareness for both position and the intention of the vessel. Now the intention of the vessel does not become very clear till such time it is very close to your territorial waters. So shouldn't there be a mechanism that you prevent it from entering the territorial water? Because then everybody will talk about freedom of navigation. I can go here, I can go there. So what criteria do you see? Because we are finding it very difficult to prove the intention till they have really come pretty close to the coastline.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was one of the things when I said, we realized the challenges, the operational challenges of really implementing MDA on the ground. So, like you said, unless the vessel is really close to your coast, you don't really know the intention, or nor can you stop vessels to come that closer because of freedom of navigation. So that's where I guess a regional framework comes into place, that if you really have a mechanism through which you are sharing information with other countries where those vessels might not be closest to your coastal waters, but that vessel could be closer to your neighboring country's coastal water. And if you have that information that you're sharing, if you have that information fusion center from where you're collating that data, and you have that larger big picture, of the entire Indian Ocean or just the entire Bay of Bengal, and you have the points or the place of movement of these vessels, I'd say that could be a good starting point to have a better understanding of who's placed where, which might turn hostile, or even being aware of how many or what is present on those waters will allow you a better response in case of a threat or disaster, I suppose.
You mentioned about the trust building is important. I think even Admiral Colombage mentioned about that we don't trust each other. So I was wondering as to what needs to be done. Maybe you can recommend something, and then I'll throw the same question to the former Sri Lankan Navy chief.
I think there are steps been taken in trust building in terms of through exercises, more interactions, Navy to Navy interactions, and even at the political level with countries that we have also worked for so long. I don't think the trust is there. I mean, with the Americans too, we've worked for so long. The trust level is not as much. We're still hesitant, or in sharing complicated data or exercises. We signed LIMOA after discussing it for 10 years, and still took some time to implement it. So I guess it's part of it is political, part of it is operational, where there would be challenges, but more interaction and more exercises where you are aware of each other's capabilities or functions. I guess that could go towards a trust building effort, but of course there are political issues on the ground which time and again hamper that advancement of trust building. So working in bilateral and trilateral, I think in the morning also we heard about India taking a lead, but it's more at a regional level, at a multilateral level. If you're engaging more with countries and you have a greater sense of how they work, what are they thinking, just more interaction, that could, I guess, offset some of the challenges we face in building trust.
Admiral, I just, one question is of course the same question, if you would like to offer some very valuable comment. The second point that I wanted to make is that you mentioned about Sri Lanka being HADR sort of hub. Do you think for that there is also a need for capacity building as far as the assets are concerned, the physical assets? For example, if they have to move into some area, or is it only going to be a network-centric hub where you actually have the wherewithal to keep people informed and move the assets or request for the assets to reach? Let us say something happens off the Bangladesh coast. It will be useful for the Eastern Naval Command probably to respond first, or maybe if it isn't. So what kind of hub that are you looking at? Only a information center, or is it is there any capacity building required?
Okay, thank you. I think to answer the first question, especially the importance of MDA, IMO has declared 57% of shipping in the Indian Ocean do not report their position accurately. It's not for terrorist related incidents, but it is because of the competition among them. So that means 57% mean large percentage of merchant marine in the Indian Ocean do not report their position accurately. So that gives us even more necessity to maintain the MDA. And then on the same breath, Admiral Sinha asked, how do we really get them to comply? Now we know that there was a recent ship which actually carried some weapons from North Korea all the way to Egypt. And then despite the regulations, they switch off the AIS when they don't want us to see them, right? So this maritime blindness is not merely because we are blind. It is because someone don't want us to see them. So, right, how do we get them to commit? So, in that breath, I think Foreign Secretary Jaishankar mentioned this in the Indian Ocean Conference also. He said we need a new kind of a security architecture for maritime domain. Now, we keep talking about MDA and then all that thing. So, we need to come out with something where we agree to abide by a rule-based maritime order in the Indian Ocean by all major maritime users. So, whether we can use IONS, we can use IORA to carry this forward. I don't know whether we can use BIMSTEC, because BIMSTEC is Bay of Bengal only, but then when you are looking at the whole of Indian Ocean, we cannot only focus on maritime domain awareness to Bay of Bengal region. Of course, that is a good start, but when we look at the overall Indian Ocean, there is another equally size portion called Western Indian Ocean. So, we have, I mean, India has like 3,500 kilometers coastline on the Western Indian Ocean. So, you need some mechanism to cover the entire Indian Ocean. Now, we do not talk about China's presence too much in this forum, but China is here. China is going to be there. And when you talk with the Chinese officials, they said we want collaborative, comprehensive, sustainable security, freedom, everything. So, we need to get them to walk the talk now. We need to get them on board in some kind of a mechanism where we abide, not only the militaries, about the white shipping, about the merchant shipping. I mean, they belong to companies. These companies are operating from various countries. So, we need to get them to comply with the international norms for the sake of them, right? So, this MDA concept is something which is very important, and I think I don't think we have made sufficient progress in the MDA. I mean, although India, Maldives and Sri Lanka started this about 4-5 years back, we have not really made sufficient progress in that regard. So, we need really to tap Bangladesh and Myanmar on the other side, and Seychelles and Mauritius on the other side. So, practically large area is covered. So, on the question of the HADR hub, what I meant is like we don't have a center to talk about disaster. We don't have a fund to respond to a disaster. So, Sri Lanka do not need to build all the infrastructure. We can use the existing infrastructure. We don't have to keep all the assets in Colombo. I mean, of course, in the Eastern Naval Command, the Vizag ship to go to Bangladesh is very quickly. But we can do the coordination, we can do the study, we can do the funding, we can do the research on this disaster management and have it ready. I propose Sri Lanka for various factors that I mentioned, but it can be somewhere. We need something before the next disaster strikes us. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Now the house is open for questions. Please just mention your name and who are you addressing your question to, sir.
Sujit. Okay, I am General Chopra. I'm a 4-war combat veteran with experience, corporate at the top. Okay, my first intervention is to our Japanese guest, Mr. Tetsuo. You said during your talk that India and Japan should ensure that China is transparent and accountable in this region, which is amplified by the Sri Lankan Admiral when he says that China does what it wants to do. So my question here immediately is, how do you arbitrate the arbitrator? But going back to Mr. Tetsuo, the Chinese BRI or the OBOR after Xi Jinping has now risen further. I feel it'll come more to the fore in this region. Do you think the efforts of Japan and India towards the east, make east, etc., will confront, or are they going to run in parallel? And a very short question to the chairman. And MDA and otherwise, we keep talking about security cooperation in the Indian Ocean. India, US, Japan, Australia, Indonesia, but we don't find Australia fitting in when we talk of the training that Darshana has spoken about, inter-cooperation. We don't even have Australia in the Malabar. Do you think the security concerns should overtake the political considerations? I don't know if Raja is still here. Maybe he can throw some light too. Thank you, Chairman.
Sujit?
I would like to ask one question, please.
Good
afternoon, I'm Sujit Samadar. My questions are on the issue of cooperation on disaster management. See, there are three aspects to it. There's an organizational issue that we spoke about. There's a financial issue that we spoke about. But I think a very important issue on cooperation is on technical issues. And those technological issues are very significant. Particularly on the surveillance and early warning systems, we already have a network of networks and some sort of infrastructure in place. But where I would like to work on is actually on response systems, where there are a whole lot of new technologies that have come up for flood prevention and flood control, containerized hospitals, containerized kitchens. There's also a whole lot of systems which have come into place for rapid energy creation and storage. So I would think that that this is a place where we can jointly cooperate. Japan has got tremendous strengths in robotics, automation, miniaturization, medical services and equipment to be able to make air transportable and ship transportable container systems that can be taken to a location rapidly, which are self-contained. And I've seen these technologies. So maybe we can look at cooperation on technological issues and be very clear in how we can containerize and miniaturize these common platforms for rapid use. So I would think that apart from organizational and financial issues, disaster management today has a huge technical component, technological component, and that we should bring that into discussions on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. General Chakravarti, sir, I'll come back to you after this.
There is one more
I'm General Chakravarti. My first question is to Darshana. Darshana, we have certain economic assets in the South China Sea. These are oil drilling platforms. Our entire discussion ends at the what you call Straits of Malacca, as I heard the first and the last. How are these going to be protected? Purely by cooperation, purely by, in what manner? And as you spoke of the Indian Navy, and as also the chair spoke, 140 ships. Are we going to restrict ourselves just to the Indian Ocean, or we always talk of the India Pacific? Do we go beyond? As a matter of fact, I found a government document on the Act East policy which says it goes right up to the western coast of United States. That's where the Act East policy ends. If that be the case, and if we are going to be just hemmed into the Bay of Bengal, which is a so small a part, how do you go? I have a question, small question on the Japanese thing. Prime Minister Abe is saying, right now, even if you have to deal with a nation, the constitution needs to be amended. A small example, if any military operation is to be taken place, even with North Korea, you have to first approach North Korea, ask him, can we send our troops? That is the status of the present constitution. So he's talking of amendments. So I do not know in what way this training is going on and patrol boats to Vietnam are going on. Is it within the ambit of the present constitution, or you're giving certain leeway to continue? And lastly, sir, you have given Sri Lanka, but this is at the edge of the Bay of Bengal. Why don't you think of Sri Lanka and the Andamans? I think a beautiful place which has got all the qualities which you said. And it came to us from Japan. It's the first place to become free for India, thanks to Japan, to have the Indian flag flying. And so I would like your comments on thinking about this, because this makes the entire region more central. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir, yourself.
My name is Irfan. I'm a counter-terrorism analyst. So as we know that South Asia is heavily infested with terrorism, my question goes to our brother from Japan. Do you think that terrorism present in South Asia has a potential threat to Japan? And how Japan can play a role in terms of curbing this terrorism in this region, irrespective of its geographical proximity? Thank you.
Thank you. Darshana, can you take on first, please?
I'll start with the South China Sea question. I agree. We have limitations in the South China Sea, but we haven't stopped going into the South China Sea. Indonesia hasn't stopped deploying into the South China Sea. The exercises haven't stopped. The port calls haven't stopped. And but if you mean in terms of the islands that have come up, China's assertiveness and what India is doing about it, if you think India is going to be the one standing up and challenging China on building artificial islands, I don't think that is going to happen, not anytime soon. But that's not the only way we can contribute. I think India has, especially in the current government, started raising its voice on the issue. We continue deploying, we continue going there. We have, we're talking about connectivity, building infrastructure there with Japan in Vietnam. We also have I think one of the biggest contributions from India has been accepting the Permanent Court of Arbitration judgment against itself in its dispute with Bangladesh, which set the stage for Philippines, which it took up in its course that didn't go. But even when the PCA ruling came out, India was one of the first countries actually, I think one of the first within 2 hours of the judgment coming out, which put out a really strong statement in support of UNCLOS. It was not in favor of or against Philippines or China, but was in favor of UNCLOS and the need to follow rules-based order and the norms established instead of and really raising the question that no actor can come in and unilaterally try and change the established norms. So I feel India's contribution, and India has, with the oil blocks that you say in Vietnam, there has been oil blocks where India hasn't really found much oil which is not economically viable, but on Vietnam's request, India has continued to stay on, and we have a presence there. We are doing much more with Vietnam. We have provided lines of credit. There is capacity building programs that are going on. We're talking about expanding that. So I think there has been a presence, and it will continue to be present there. It will be more through, I suppose, in support of international law, in support of rules and norms, and in building the capacity of the littorals of the South China Sea to deter, rather than really sending in your military ships to block China from doing the island building. I don't think that that is in India's calculations, strategic calculations, or capability or resources. So I think that our contribution has been more in terms of diplomatic support and capacity building, and just standing up every time something has happened to say that you unilaterally cannot change that. I quickly want to touch on I know the question was on to you about Australia and the MDA and then how it fits into the collective security architecture. I mean, India and Australia together also can build, start their own exercises, and Australia is now talking about developing the Cocos and the Keelings, the Christmas Islands. India is talking about building up the Andaman Islands. You have access to the Malacca Straits, you have access to the Bay of Bengal. Australia collaborates with Thailand, there is collaborations with Sri Lanka, so they are in our neighborhood, they are working. So you can really merge those two collaborations and then extend it to a trilateral. You can do more with Sri Lanka, India, Australia, Sri Lanka, you can do with Indonesia. So and Malabar is one set of it. I mean, that's more political. If it's not working out, doesn't mean we can't go beyond that and create another architecture, another structure that can actually work to address what is going on. We don't really have to get stuck to Malabar. Malabar will happen. It's a political decision. It's a political calculation. Whenever it happens, it happens. But I think there is scope to go beyond that and do much more trilateral and forming new multilateral and trilateral engagements.
Thank you. Admiral,
Yeah, I think respond to Sujit, fully agreed that technology can play a role. Only thing is, in disasters, the technology can give us warning, but sometimes the warning is very short. I mean, in the case of a tsunami, it may be few hours depending on the intensity. And the cyclones can be predicted, but the actual time it hits the land can be predicted only few hours before, because the path, it can vary the path. So there are, yes, we need, I think India has gone ahead with tsunami warning system. We didn't have a tsunami warning system. We depended on Hawaii to get information, but now we have that in the region, so that's a great thing. And then I think the point of having a center in one, wherever it is, whether it is Andaman or Sri Lanka, is to really identify where these sources can be obtained, where the mattresses can be obtained, where the blankets can be obtained, where the water pumps can be obtained. In a hurry, not really when after something happened. You cannot have everything in stock. Even you can't store rations for a long time because there is a expiry date. But when you are having a center, you identify these things, which country can provide that for the center. So in response to a general's thing, why not Andaman Nicobar? So I was focusing on South Asia. Now we cannot disregard Pakistan, no matter whether we like it or not, and Afghanistan. So that is, in that sense only, I recommended Sri Lanka to be the hub. Of course, everything what I spoke about, Andaman Nicobar is having. Even India is having many of the things I spoke about. I mean, we can't deny the fact. But what I was thinking is the South Asian perspective.
And I think a lot of discussion is going on about this maritime domain awareness, how to develop this thing. To me, there were three key events which happened during the last 2 weeks. One is, of course, Prime Minister Abe winning the 2/3 majority. Other one is the 19th Congress, Communist Party Congress, in which President Xi said by 2030 they want to be a modernized military. And also he said they have no hegemonic ambitions. And on the other hand, in Washington, Secretary of State Tillerson said that the link with India is purely, first time in public he said, to counter China. So I do not know how this equation is going to work in the future. If you are, I mean, in the morning we heard it is not to counter China. Our Foreign Secretary very categorically said, no, it is not to counter. Now we hear Secretary of State Tillerson publicly saying that purely to counter China, that relationship is being built. So how this, now that is why I argue, whether we like it or not, there is a maritime Cold War in the Indian Ocean taking place. China is on one side, maybe little support from Pakistan, then Japan, India and USA invariably on one side. Now that put many other states in a strategic dilemma, like Sri Lanka, right? So that is the problem, that is the situation in the Indian Ocean, I would argue. Thank you.
Well, first of all, whether Japan and China will confront over the BRI and the open free Indo-Pacific strategy, I don't think the confrontation is inevitable. We can avoid such a scenario by closely working together. And Prime Minister Abe himself stated in May that Japan may be able to consider how we can cooperate with the BRI initiative. So basically, Japan and China are trying to provide models for infrastructure construction in this region, and Japan is trying to provide high quality standard models, and we are trying to make sure that China's becomes a subprime loan in this region. But in the case of maritime security, because connectivity really requires the maritime security, and if China tries to change the status quo in the maritime domain, and if China tries to change the maritime rules, I think Japan would definitely to try to make every effort to preserve the maritime, the rule of law in the maritime domain with the like-minded nations. And about the constitution, yes, Prime Minister Abe is now advocating the change in the constitution, but in fact our ODA charter was changed before the reinterpretation of the constitution, and we changed our guidance on the arms export before the reinterpretation of the constitution. So those issues with regard to the capacity building has less to do with our constitution. And what Prime Minister Abe is trying to do is just constitutionalize the self-defense force. And perhaps if he does so, that would just increase the morale for the self-defense force officers, but there will be no substantial change. Thirdly, the terrorism. Terrorism is a global threat. So, regardless of where it happens, Japan will oppose to any terrorism. And the terrorism in this, if terrorism happens in this region, Japan will take it as a serious threat, not only to Japan but to the international society. And I think Japan is willing to provide any assistance to the regional countries so that they can build its own counter-terrorism capabilities. Of course, there may be certain restrictions because of our domestic regulations, but I think Japan will try to maximize our efforts to help the regional countries.
Professor Muni, followed by Admiral Murugesan and Commodore Ajay Singh. Then I'll come back to you. Professor Muni, sir.
Thank you. My question is to the panel or anybody else who wants to respond to it. I am a bit puzzled at the references repeatedly in all such seminars on pearls and diamonds, which really amounts to the infrastructure being used for strategic purposes. And that seems to be the trend in fashion. The word again, even in this panel we heard about is China is there and we have to balance it. Now, I remember that the same countries of Bay of Bengal and India included had talked about the peace zone in Indian Ocean. And we had asked the great powers to get out of it. Now probably the regional players are exactly doing what we did not want others to do. What are the consequences of this? Or is there a way out where rather than getting into the race for building strategic assets and infrastructure, do something where this kind of a competition can either be curbed or contained, or if not reversed at all?
Admiral Murugesan.
During the deliberations of the Maritime Security Cooperation Panel, one thing has come out is the deficiencies in the maritime domain awareness. Various statistics have come out. Unless we have the maritime domain awareness, security cannot be provided. So the requirement is everyone is aware, but nobody wants to participate in that domain awareness. As Ms. Baruah said, that it cannot be done by one country. Everyone has to join hands. So I want to give an example of another domain which Admiral Sinha fully is aware, is the air domain. You see in the air domain, the scope of the air domain is as vast as the maritime domain. It may be more compared to the maritime domain. But there is almost close to 100% compliance. Yeah. Nobody can get airborne without other person's knowledge. Everyone knows who is flying, where is he going, at what height, what speed, where is he destined, whether it is a passenger airliner or a commercial aircraft or a military aircraft. Everything is transparent. There's something makes us comply there compared to the maritime domain. So this needs to be examined. The same political sensibilities, the same reservations are applicable to air also. Whereas we share information there. I'm not talking about a world war. I suppose if the world war is going on, nobody will announce that he is taking off. But in the peacetime scenario, there's 100% clarity in the air. But that is not there in the maritime domain. So we need to think on this. What is the incentive in the air domain where everybody plugs in, and what is the disadvantages in the maritime when nobody wants to participate? Maybe Ms. Baruah can.
Ajay, Commodore Ajay Singh, we'll come back to you, sir.
So I have two quick questions on basically on regional security in the maritime domain. Navies are basically war-fighting machines. They're meant for war fightings. But whenever we talk of regional security at the Navy level, we stop short of saying, are we going to help each other in war? And we, obfuscate the issue by saying HADR and MD, maritime domain awareness, situational awareness. But the fundamental, these fancy destroyers and aircraft carriers and helicopter carriers are not meant for HADR. HADR will happen in any case. So all this effort that's being put into this so-called regional connectivity and regional cooperation being built up through various mechanisms, exercises, bilateral exercises, multilateral exercises, are none of them aimed at helping each other when the balloon goes up? Are they only meant for these kind of benign activities? That's my first question. Second question is that, particularly in the Indo-Japan context, while we've been talking a lot about this Indo-Japan regional connection and strategic relationship and, becoming more and more important with China becoming a major factor, in the defense cooperation area, there's practically nothing that has happened between India and Japan. The US too was supposed to be this path-breaking strategic initiative between the two prime ministers. Japan's first defense export without weapons, but has a role to play. It hasn't gone anywhere. For whatever reasons, I still haven't understood. We issued an RFI for submarines in the recent 75I. It was sent to Japan as well. As a submariner, we all know that the Japanese submarines were not suited for our purpose. And Japan rightly has turned around and said, has not responded to that RFI. So why did we, in the first place, send it when we knew we wouldn't get a response from them? It sent a very different message from the message that would have gone had we not even sent them the RFI knowing that their submarine is not suited to our requirement. But the fact that we sent an RFI and they haven't responded has sent a different message. So at a time when we are trying to show the world that India and Japan are so close and getting closer by the day, these are not the right messages that are getting conveyed in the defense cooperation areas. So these are the 2 points I had.
Mr. Kaul?
Comparison was made by the previous speaker with regard to the compliance in aviation compared to the non-compliance in over high seas. Now that's because over time, the Chicago Convention in 1944 created International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a very strong organization, plus it gave sovereignty over airspace, over the land territory, whereas high seas are global commons, and therefore there is a lack of compliance there. So these are issues which need to be tackled. On top of that, there was a mention that the Malaysian airline which went away could not be traced. Now that's because of technology. The radars which are used are only land-based, and high seas hardly has any surveillance, but new technologies are coming up. There is a new technology called ADS-B over satellite, which will probably sort out all these issues. So that was my comment. Thank you.
All right. Let me try and address 1 or 2 questions myself, then I'll ask my panelists. One is, Darshana did mention about this Australia not being part of this Quad. Very rightly, it is just one aspect of collaboration, the military exercises. The other collaboration which is in process is that we have a bilateral Indo-Australia exercise already in place. Last month itself it was conducted. The second thing is that the initiative which has been taken for the South Pacific Islands, the Prime Minister Modi had called for a meeting and he had reached out to all of them. They are coming round to understand that whatever capacity building is Australia doing for these island nations, can India pitch in? So that is one initiative which is being taken. So they are going to cooperate in capacity building. So the point is that you may or may not have assets to physically intervene in everything that goes on, may not have enough assets to do the exercises in far off places, but certainly you do have capability of helping those countries develop the capability so that they can take care of themselves. So I think this is one. But importantly, it will very much be a political decision where I've just attended one discussion in Tokyo, and the sense I got that it will happen when the time is ripe. So whatever it means, I think it's a very political sort of statement. The second mention was that of why are we restricting? I think General Chakravarti made the mention. Why are we restricting to the Indian Ocean? Essentially for capacity. Even the US doesn't have a capacity to do the monitoring around the world, and that is why they are gradually beginning to withdraw. So US is becoming more and more inward looking. They said rebalancing etc. is fine, but the assets are getting stretched because of their involvement in some other places. I just want to take you back to 2007 when Admiral Mike Mullen was the CNO of the US Navy. He mentioned that we require 1,000 ship navy worldwide to maintain surveillance and have a proper maritime domain awareness. You know, we are not even reached 2/3. If you take all ships into account, we haven't reached that level. So I think the very vast expense and the time it takes for the maritime assets to move from one place to other, what we can do is that pull in all the resources and get connected, but that is asking for, that's very wishful thinking. And the reasons have been just mentioned by Mr. Kaul, he just mentioned, Admiral Murugesan also mentioned. What happens in there is primarily, the life is at threat immediately. If you don't follow the rule, you might just collide and so many people will get killed. And there is no way you can do anything about it subsequently except for going to find the wreckage. So, which doesn't happen at sea, really. It takes time. So that is one. The second thing is that the trade is still the cheapest mode of transportation is overseas, and therefore, by and large, the rules at sea have been kept pretty loose, and that's why you have so many people who are wanting to follow, not wanting to follow. Rules have been UNCLOS has been made, but a lot of countries have not ratified. US being one of them. But by and large, they say fine, the rule of the rule-based order should be maintained, whatever it means. And as somebody said, there are no borders. You have an airspace assigned to one country, you have ADZ, but here you look at the UNCLOS itself. I think it is time to relook at the UNCLOS, possibly to take what you are saying into account. Yeah. We have had this seminar, in Indian UNCLOS seminar in Port Blair, where Admiral was also around, so was Darshana. I think it's a time to relook at UNCLOS. Is it addressing everything of today? UNCLOS has been practiced, from actually speaking from 50s, and it came into actual being in 1982, I think. So maybe it is time for us to change. I will stop there, and I will just request each of the speakers to make. I am being shown, time up from there. Just one minute comment each. Yeah.
Okay. So the navies and militaries are basically established for war fighting. I completely agree. And the military's main mission is, of course, deterrence and defense. But those capabilities can be used for other purposes, including the HADR. The only difference between war fighting and the HADR is whether you shoot or not. Japanese self-defense force has been engaged in the HADR missions, and in 2011, 311 happened, and
I think you 1 minute is up.
The self-defense force and U.S. Navy conducted Operation Tomodachi.
Right.
And the reason why we were successful, because we trained for war fighting all the way, all the time. So I think we should never forget about the importance of the war fighting capabilities.
Sir,
well, very briefly, Professor Muni suggested this infrastructure being used for strategic purposes. If I can share, you might argue, 4 cases of sea blindness or maritime blindness in the Indian Ocean. One was Somali piracy. Number 2 was the Sri Lankan situation, where we did not realize the potential being used by our adversary. 3, Mumbai attack. 4th is China coming into the Indian Ocean in a large way. So these are the 4 areas of maritime blindness. I would suggest, we can argue. So strategic purpose, the infrastructure being for strategic purposes, but they were building around India mostly. So didn't you see that happening, sir? This is something we have to ask ourselves. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, quickly on one thing, I think you've heard about this on the maritime domain, why there's a lot of discussions, but not much has happened. You talked about MDA and non-compliance. I think one thing I wanted to point out was also because discussions on maritime domain has only really started recently. Yes, the Navy was always talking about it, but from an Indian political and strategic point of view, this discussion is very, very fresh. It's very new. The security environment that was there in the Indian Ocean 10 years ago, 5 years ago, did not warrant that kind of urgency for Indian political class to probably take that kind of attention, pay that kind of attention. That has emerged now in the last 5 to 3 years, and that is why we are having these discussions now. coming up with the challenges and trying to figure out the new framework that should come into place. And that's why we are only beginning to talk about white shipping and signing it. And we've had, in Australia is a part of the Indian Ocean region, we had the first bilateral exercise in 2015. So late. It's because only the environment has really urged you to take a fresh look at it. Before that, there was no urgency, and there were other tasks at home that was keeping you busy. So I think that is why the discussion starting now is going to take a long time, but at least we are beginning. So I think that's a great news.
Well, thank you, audience. Your indulgence has been really good, and I'm sure there are a lot of grey areas which need to be covered. And one way to address what Professor Muni said is this last word, the cooperation. That's the only way to avoid this, and the whole effort is to do that. All I have to say is to just give a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you. We break for lunch and we assemble after an hour.
Yes, so lunch is served across the hall on the other venue. Please feel free to come back, and we'll convene around 2:10. We have a keynote starting at 2:15 by Mr. Amitabh Kant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you.